Five. Now, for those of you who still have not got over your hangovers, a number of things have been happening in the news recently, which I think you may be, first of all, A, amused by, and B, perhaps taken aback by. Now, the first of these news stories today that I have noticed on various feeds, but interestingly not in the Unionist newspapers or on Unionist television north of the border, is, first of all, a story about the Sheriff of Nottingham. No, not the one from Robin Hood, but there is a connection actually between this story and the mythical figure of Robin of Locksley. It's emerged that the Labour Sheriff of Nottingham, this is a lady who was a member of the local Labour Party and who is notionally the current Sheriff of Nottingham, has decided that she needs to resign because she voted against Labour's policies of cutting winter fuel allowance and various other policies which she felt were robbing from the poor. So it's obvious to me, at least, and to the person writing the article on the social media, that this woman has decided that she has become, instead of the Sheriff of Nottingham being a good person, she's now robbing from the poor to give to the rich, and feels that she has to resign. But not before the Labour Party had suspended her membership of the party for voting against Sir Keir Starmer's cuts. Now, the Labour Party is also in the news for another reason, and it's not good publicity again for the Labour government. And that piece of news is that Ed Milliband, who's currently the Energy Secretary under Sir Keir Starmer's government, and part of, presumably as a minister, part of the cabinet, has decided to force through the planning consent for a massive solar farm in the east of England. Now, the reason why this is a big story is basically the fact that the criticism leveled against Mr. Milliband is not that he's desperately trying to increase the amount of renewable energy which England has access to, although that is part of this, but the fact that he's using up valuable agricultural land has angered people worried about the food security of the English state. Now, remember that because mostly English voters voted to leave the European Union, that has meant that much of the food which we used to enjoy from Europe, which was imported without tariffs and taxes, is now far too expensive for us to buy, and therefore we're forced to grow it, or rather the English farmers are forced to grow it here in what is currently the UK. But this adoption of a massive solar farm in farmland is perhaps the thin end of the wedge going in, and is seen by many farmers as the beginning of the end of food farming in some areas of England, especially those flat areas where they can plaster solar panels by the thousands across arable farmland. This is desperate stuff coming from the Labour government, which was already weak when it was elected, but has now been forced to try and face the problems of energy scarcity in the United Kingdom. And I'm using that term advisedly here. There's no energy scarcity in Scotland. Most of the energy produced in Scotland that isn't used in Scotland is now flowing into England, either in the form of gas and undersea pipelines directly from Scottish gas fields, or is being cabled to England via the energy grid. Now, for years, energy supply companies in Scotland complained that there was not enough capacity to export the surplus electricity being manufactured in Scotland over the border. And suddenly that has become a good idea. And so the English government has decided to build lots of extra cables to carry this current down to England, which needs it. So for Scotland, at least, it shows the value of Scottish energy exports into England, because they're basically keeping the lights on further south. And this is a problem which Milliband, as the Energy Secretary, is going to find it difficult to solve, because England just simply does not have the sheer numbers of wind farms offshore and onshore and tidal energy farms which Scotland has already built, and therefore they're dependent on Scotland for much of their energy. Now, in connection with this current state of affairs in England, where Milliband is planning to basically smother English farmland in solar panels in an effort to try and boost local production, It's been announced by the Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky that Ukraine has now switched off the main gas pipeline which piped Russian energy from the Arctic Circle into Western Europe. So there's no gas supply now from Russia passing through this pipeline across Ukraine and into Western Europe, cutting off one of the biggest revenue streams to Vladimir Putin and denying him extra money, basically, to continue the war in Ukraine. Now, I mention this not because I have a particular stance on Ukraine at the moment, although I maybe talk about that another time, but I mention this because it is relevant to what is happening with England and its lack of power at the moment, and the fact that Scotland is the prime supplier for both electricity and gas to England to kind of tide it through this period where it isn't producing enough of its own electricity and gas to keep the lights on and to keep its citizens warm during the winter months. Now, the reason I mention this is that England is uniquely vulnerable to anything that goes wrong with the grids from Scotland to England carrying either this energy or the gas. Now, what I'm about to say is probably a little bit shocking, but if Scotland were independent right now and it had already taken control over its domestic supply of energy, both in terms of gas and electricity, it would be able to say to the English state, if you want this gas and electricity, you now have to pay for it at the rates set by your own price cap. And that would mean that England would have to import its energy from Scotland at cost price, at the full market value, something which it has denied to Scotland ever since they started siphoning our power and our gas off. And that is something which is going to continue until Scots vote for independence. So Scottish voters who are in favour of leaving the UK Union for this and many other reasons are now faced with a difficult choice over the next 2 years, who to vote for in the Scottish general elections. Now, before you start saying, well, we've got to vote for the SNP, well, that would, on the face of it, normally be the way of doing this. But since the SNP has been in power for years, tens of years, and has not advanced the case of independence during that period, it's kind of obvious that the parliamentary SNP is not showing any kind of inclination to want to sever ties with the United Kingdom politically and take back its powers. And that leaves us with a very difficult choice, because at the moment, Alba, for all of their good intentions, have kind of queered the pitch a little bit with an announcement by Ash Regan that she would welcome the influence of some kind of Mac Musk, an Elon Musk figure in Scotland, to try to dislodge those people who are currently Scottish MPs and replace them with those who will fight for independence in a way which actually produces an independence referendum. But the idea of courting Mr. Musk, which is sort of alluded to in this, has attracted criticism to Alba, which leaves us with not very many people to choose from in terms of parties. My argument for many years has been that Scotland doesn't need a system of parliamentary party politics, because that is what the problem is in England. English voters have only ever had two choices, either the red Tories or the blue Tories. We've got the red Tories in at the moment. They made a whole lot of promises which were lies, and they're doing precisely the opposite of what they claimed they would do. And this is where Scottish politics is at the moment as well. We have a lot of politicians who claim they're going to do things that we want them to do and then don't do them. And I think if we want people to be elected who are definitely going to form a government which will take back full control of parliamentary powers in Edinburgh, and then use those to legislate for a proper Scottish referendum on leaving the Union, one which is both sponsored by the United Nations and observed and curated by them, so there can be no foul play, then we don't really have much choice, because at the moment, the political parties that I see who are nominally pro-independence haven't yet committed themselves to something like this. And until they do, we don't really have much choice. Somebody mentioned to me in a tweet the other day, he said, why don't you run as an MSP candidate? Well, there's a fair chance that I might. There's also a fair chance that a lot of other pro-independence activists and bloggers and video makers and others might also do the same, because we all feel the same way, that party politics is not the way to get independence. We need a popular movement with popular politicians, not populist politicians like Farage or Trump, but popular politicians who will actually do what they say, who want to be elected not because they want the cushy job with the salary for the next 5 years, but because they want desperately to actually take the action necessary to free Scotland from the grip of an English state which is siphoning off all its energy resources for nothing. We have an immense amount of power, not just in terms of the energy that we have, but the political power to withhold that energy from England unless we get what we need. I'm not suggesting, incidentally, that we should just simply cut off the power and gas supplies to England until they give us independence. What I am suggesting is that if we vote for individual MSPs who will form a majority government which will take the necessary steps to have a democratic vote on independence, once we've achieved independence, we can then control the flow of that energy and we can charge the going rate for it and actually make some revenues from that. It would also give us immense political power, because if you take the example of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin, Putin has used energy as a weapon. He has weaponized the energy supply to Europe. He has weaponized the food supply from Ukraine to the rest of the world. And he basically is using all these levers in so-called hybrid warfare to manipulate the political landscape around him. And this is something which, although despicable when used by an authoritarian or a dictator, is something which would be useful with a legitimate government which has the powers to control such things. And this is where I believe that independence would give us the whip hand for the first time in 300 years. And the whip hand not to exploit England, but to simply charge a fair rate for the energy that we sell to them. And if they don't want to buy it from us, they're going to have to buy it on the open market at the same prices anyway, whereas they could do a much better deal with Scotland in exchange for some much more favourable settlement when we do actually become independent. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the time is now ripe for all of us out there in independence land to start talking about who we should vote for. I've mentioned putting pressure on our pro-independence politicians to commit to something like this, to actually holding a referendum under the auspices of the United Nations and under our right to self-determination, which we clearly have. And yet nobody has taken the bait yet. Nobody in the political parties, that is, yet. I'm waiting to see what Colette Walker from the ISP has to say on this matter. I know that she favours this type of democracy, and the ISP has a very different attitude to the way independence can be achieved and how we achieve it, and is not seeking constant re-election as some other parties are. I'm less aware of what Alba is planning at the moment, and therefore I'm not going to make critical comments about them, apart from this rather strange tweet by Ash Regan about the idea of a sort of Mac Musk figure, a billionaire coming in to help bankroll a new fight for independence. Although the money would be useful, it's not really the money that we need, it's people's support that we need to vote for candidates who will actually take the action required. So, Alba, I don't know. At the moment, I remain to be convinced, and I'm waiting for somebody in the Alba party to explain to me what their policy will be for 2026, if they have actually sorted that out yet. As far as the SNP is concerned, well, we're just seeing regular daily announcements of things that you would expect from a governing party, but nothing in any of this stuff which actually relates to independence in any meaningful way, which is a shame, because now would be the time to make such an announcement, because now would be the time when it would have the biggest impact in the depths of winter, when people are struggling to pay huge energy bills because of the actions of the British state in setting the price cap so high. They could easily have set it lower and made sure that everybody survived the winter intact, but they didn't. And that is something which Keir Starmer is continuing, despite the fact that his party claimed they would reduce energy bills. So although all this stuff is obvious, it's not obvious apparently to Keir Starmer, who seems to be operating under a completely different agenda. And I suspect that Keir Starmer is operating an agenda which has been set for him by the establishment and by the British civil service, who actually are really running the country. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. A lot of food for thought. But the Sheriff of Nottingham, a Labour Sheriff of Nottingham, resigning because she has been robbing the poor and giving to the rich. That's an interesting one. It's quite funny. And Ed Milliband getting it in the neck for plastering thousands of solar panels over farmland in East England is another sign of desperation from a Labour government which cannot keep the lights on. And if we take a leaf out of the book of the Ukrainians and use energy as a bargaining chip once we are independent, I'm not saying we should just cut it off as a sort of act of sabotage, but then again, these cables and these pipelines are very vulnerable to attacks by other countries. We've already seen pipelines and power cables getting wrecked by ships dragging their anchors in the Baltic Sea. It doesn't take much to trash one of these undersea cables or pipelines. And so it would be good if Scotland had control over its own resources and was able to sell them at the going price. And that is really all I'm suggesting. So have a good new year, everybody, but have a think about who you want to elect in 2026, and perhaps ask some of your party officials, especially those in the parliamentary parties, how they intend to satisfy the demands of Scottish independence voters that there will be the powers back to Holyrood to hold a referendum despite whatever the British state says. Because no matter what happens, if we want independence, everything is going to converge on the single point. It's inevitable, where we have to challenge the United Kingdom's grasp on political power, deny them it in Scotland, and cause a political confrontation in the UK for the first time in 300 years. But without that confrontation, no further progress can be made. And without politicians brave enough to take the step, it's not going to happen. Anyway, that is it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed today's New Year broadcast, if you want to call it that. I hope you're enjoying what's left of the New Year holiday. And when you get back to work, we'll give some consideration to some of the things I've been talking about today. Anyway, that's it from me today. Please keep the faith. And remember, Inde-Car will be back on your screens on a fairly regular basis, a couple of times a week through the next year or so. That may increase in frequency, incidentally, if some of our politicians start to react to the sort of things I've been saying today. Okay, I'll see you all soon. Keep the faith. Don't forget to tune into Inde-Car, and if you can afford to donate, I'll post some links on my timeline, both on X, on Blue Sky, and anywhere else I can find to put them. That's it from me today. Keep the faith. Bye for now.